Chapter 1. A Cry in the Dark. The moon hung low over the dusty plains, casting a silvery glow over craggy hills that stretched far beyond Sarah's small, weather-beaten cabin. The air was thick with the smell of sagebrush and the distant scent of horses. A cold wind swept across the land, rustling the dry grasses and whispering secrets from a world beyond. In the solitude of her small home, Sarah sat by the hearth, the flickering flames the only warmth against the harsh chill of the night. The baby's cry cut through the stillness like a knife. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was a sound that made her heart ache, a desperate wail that echoed to the walls of her loneliness. She looked down at the empty cradle by the fireplace, the blanket still untouched, the room eerily quiet except for the wind's mournful howl. Her hands trembled as she reached for the half-empty tin cup of cold coffee that had long lost its warmth. The faint sound of hooves on the dirt road outside made her stiffen. She shook her head, trying to focus, trying to steady her thoughts. The baby cried again. The child had been sick for days now, and Sarah felt her exhaustion settle deep in her bones. She had no more milk, no more money to buy food. Her hands were calloused from working the land, but it was never enough. Not enough to keep the roof from leaking, not enough to feed her child. She stood, her boots thudding softly on the wooden floor as she moved toward the window. The wind howled through cracks in the walls, but the night was eerily quiet beyond that. Then, like a flicker of a shadow, a figure appeared on the dirt path that led to her door. She squinted through the dim light, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't expecting anyone, but the figure was unmistakable. A tall man, rugged and lean, with the broad shoulders of a cowboy who had spent his life out on the open range. He rode a dark horse, the saddle creaking under his weight as he slowed to a stop just outside. The sound of spurs clicking against the wood of the porch seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of the night. Sarah stepped back from the window, her breath shaky. She barely knew the man, Jack, a drifter who had passed through the small town only a few days earlier. She had caught a glimpse of him at the saloon, tall and silent, always on the edge of the crowd. Now, here he was, standing at her door, the light from the lantern outside catching the worn leather of his coat and the shadow of his hat. He knocked once, a sharp, deliberate sound that echoed in the stillness. "Sarah?" His voice was rough, low, as though he hadn't spoken much lately. "I heard the baby. Thought I might be able to help." For a moment, Sarah just stood there, frozen in disbelief. The pride in her chest swelled, a fierce, protective instinct to shield her child from the world. But the hunger in the baby's cries was too loud, too real to ignore. She opened the door, the hinges creaking as the cold night air rushed in. Jack was standing there, his eyes tired but steady, his hand holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Milk," he said simply, his voice just above a whisper. He held it out to her. "And a little something else. My last dollar. If you need it." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She didn't want to take anything from him. She barely knew him, but the desperation in his eyes, the quiet determination that had led him to her doorstep, made it hard to refuse. Her fingers brushed his as she took the bundle, their touch brief but somehow electric, as if the world outside had fallen away, leaving just the two of them in the fragile light of the lantern. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt too small, too fragile against the weight of what she was feeling. Jack nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he tipped his hat and turned to leave. "Take care of yourself," he said over his shoulder, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. "You and the little one." And then, without another word, he was gone, fading into the night as quietly as he had arrived. The only sound was the soft clinking of his spurs and the distant call of a coyote, echoing across the plains. Sarah closed the door, her heart heavy, yet strangely warmed by the small kindness. She stood there for a moment, holding the milk, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. And then she took a deep breath, and with the baby still crying, she prepared to face another night. Chapter 2. The Cowboy's Offer. The morning sun had barely risen when Sarah woke to the soft rustling of leaves outside her window. The wind had picked up again during the night, sweeping the dry earth in swirling, dusty clouds. Her bones ached from the night's restless sleep, but it was the baby's cries that had kept her from finding any real rest. She looked down at the child in her arms, pale and listless, his tiny body trembling. She gently rocked him, whispering softly, but he didn't quiet. There was no milk, no comfort to offer him except her presence. As the minutes stretched into hours, Sarah's mind raced, fighting against the same helplessness she had felt since her husband's death. She had never wanted to rely on anyone, but now, with the weight of motherhood pressing against her chest, she realized how alone she really was, how far from the world she had once known. The knock at the door shattered her thoughts. Startled, Sarah stood quickly, her hand still clutching the baby, her heart racing. She had hoped that last night's visitor was a dream, but there he was again, Jack. Her breath hitched as she crossed the wooden floor toward the door. The wind howled outside, but the stillness inside the cabin was deafening. When she opened the door, Jack stood there, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his brow, his weathered face shadowed by the morning light. He didn't speak at first, just stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch between them. "I brought more," he said finally, his voice gruff as ever. "I've been thinking about you and the baby." Sarah stiffened, unsure of how to respond. He was offering something again, something she couldn't quite put her pride aside to accept. The last time he had given her milk and his last dollar, it had been a kindness she couldn't ignore, but it had also been a reminder of everything she had lost, everything she was too proud to ask for. Jack shifted his weight from one boot to the other, waiting patiently, as if he'd anticipated her hesitation. His eyes never left hers, those dark, steady eyes that seemed to understand too much. "I don't need charity," Sarah said, her voice more brittle than she intended. She glanced down at the baby, then back at Jack, her hands clenching the edges of the door. "I can manage." Jack didn't flinch. He didn't even look offended. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small sack of flour, tied tightly with a string. He held it out to her, his expression unreadable. "I'm not offering charity," he said quietly. "I'm offering help. Ain't no shame in that." The words hung in the air between them, thick with tension. Sarah wanted to refuse, to slam the door and pretend she didn't need anyone. But as she looked, finally, she took the sack from him, her fingers brushing his for the briefest of moments. Her pulse quickened at the contact, an odd warmth flooding her chest. She wanted to look away, but she didn't. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen, not as a widow or a poor mother, but as a woman, raw and real, standing before a man who saw her struggle and still chose to help. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Jack nodded, his eyes softening just slightly. "I don't need any thanks, Sarah. Just don't try to carry it all on your own. No one can do that." A flicker of something passed between them, something unspoken, but was enough to make Sarah's heart ache in a way she wasn't prepared for. "I'll be around," Jack said, his tone turning more practical. "I've got work to do down by the creek. But if you need anything else, anything at all, you just holler. Don't be proud, Sarah, not when it comes to your boy." She swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. "I won't forget it," she murmured, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Jack tipped his hat and turned to leave, his spurs clinking against the dry ground. Sarah watched him go, her hand still resting on the door, her mind a tangle of emotions she couldn't make sense of. She didn't know how to let someone in. She didn't know how to trust a man like Jack, who lived on the fringes of society, a drifter with no ties to anything but the open road. But in that moment, she couldn't deny the ache in her heart, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry everything on her own. As Jack disappeared down the dirt path, Sarah closed the door slowly, her fingers lingering on the worn wood, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't so lonely. Chapter 3. The Weight of the Past. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, a pale orange glow settling over the horizon like a soft blanket over the earth. The prairies stretched out endlessly, the wind whispering through the dry grasses. Inside the cabin, the scent of fresh-baked bread mingled with the bitter tang of the wood fire, offering a momentary illusion of warmth. The stove in the corner was still glowing faintly, but it was a baby's steady breathing that filled the room, the small body cradled against Sarah's chest as she sat by the hearth. She had learned to ignore the gnawing emptiness inside her, the hunger that never seemed to disappear, the weight of the past that clung to her like a second skin. But some nights, like tonight, it was harder to keep the ghosts at bay. There was a knock on the door, soft but insistent. Sarah didn't need to look to know who it was. Jack had been stopping by every other day since that first night, each time bringing something, some small gift of sustenance or kindness. At first, she'd resisted, stiffening against the idea of accepting help from a man she barely knew. But now, when the hunger in her son's cries became too much to bear, it was Jack's face that she saw in her thoughts, the offer of milk and his last dollar still vivid in her mind. A man like him, wandering through life, didn't owe her anything, and yet he kept coming back. "Come in," she called softly, her voice strained, though she had no idea why she felt this way. She had no reason to be ashamed. He was helping, and yet the door creaked open, and there he was, stepping into the cabin like he owned it, tall, strong, with the faint smell of horse and dust clinging to him. His hat was tilted slightly forward, shadowing his face, but there was something warm in his eyes, something that made Sarah's pulse quicken. "Evening," Jack said, his voice low and steady. He held a small sack in his hand, the leather worn from use, his fingers wrapped tightly around it. His gaze met hers, and he paused, like he was unsure what to say next. "Thought you might need some help with the chores. It's getting a little too much for one woman, especially with a little one." Sarah shifted uneasily, standing up from her chair, cradling her son against her chest. She took a step back from him, not out of fear, but out of a reflex she couldn't explain. His presence seemed to fill the room, making everything else feel a little too close. "That's mighty kind of you, Jack," she said, but there was an edge to her words, a thin veil of pride she couldn't quite mask. "But I've got things under control. I don't need help." Jack didn't seem offended. Instead, he took a step forward, his boots creaking softly against the wooden floor, his gaze never leaving her. The silence between them stretched for a moment, thick and heavy with unspoken words. "Maybe you don't need it," he said, his voice low, "but maybe you deserve it. You're working yourself to the bone, Sarah. That boy is going to need more than just your strength to make it through. You ain't got to do it alone." The words hit her like a slap, and for a moment, Sarah just stared at him, the weight of his observation settling into her bones. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she could do it all on her own, that she didn't need help from anyone, but there was a rawness in his eyes, a quiet understanding that made her chest tighten. She didn't know how to explain it, but the distance between them felt smaller than it ever had before. "I'm not sure what I need, Jack," she said, her voice quieter now, almost as though she was speaking to herself. She set her son gently on the cradle and turned away from him, moving toward the window as the sun dipped lower in the sky. "But I've been alone for so long. Don't know how to let anyone in." Jack's steps were quiet as he moved to stand beside her, his presence like a shadow in the dim light of the cabin. She could feel the warmth of his body clothes, could smell the earthiness of his sweat, the faint hint of leather and tobacco. "Don't have to let me in, Sarah," Jack murmured, his voice just above a whisper. "But if you ever need a hand, I'll be here. I don't have much, but I've got what counts, my word, and I don't go back on that." The simple sincerity of his words hit her harder than any gesture could have. It wasn't about the sack of flour or the milk or the quiet promise of protection. It was about the fact that he was there, standing next to her, asking for nothing in return, giving everything. He didn't owe her a thing, but he was here, offering his strength, his time, his presence. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the room and the gentle sound of Jack's voice wash over her. The baby shifted in the cradle, and Sarah's heart clenched with something she couldn't quite place. Vulnerability? Hope? Maybe both. "I'm scared, Jack," she whispered before she could stop herself. "I'm scared of needing someone. Scared of needing help." Jack was silent for a long moment, and Sarah didn't dare to look at him. But then she felt his hand on her shoulder, strong but gentle, a quiet reassurance that she hadn't realized she needed until now. "You don't have to be scared," Jack said softly. "We all need someone, even cowboys like me." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah let her guard down. The ache in her chest softened just a little as she turned toward him, meeting his steady gaze. There, in the fading light of the evening, Sarah knew that she was no longer completely alone, and for the first time, that didn't seem so bad. Chapter 4. Rough Riders and Dangerous Men. The night had fallen over the town like a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating. The pale glow of lanterns flickered weakly against the cold wind that swept through the dusty streets. The saloon doors creaked in the breeze, and the sound of boots on wooden floors mingled with the raucous laughter and the clinking of whiskey glasses. The town's only watering hole, a place where men gathered to forget the way of the world, was as noisy as ever, but tonight it felt darker. Tension simmered just beneath the surface, like a pot left too long over a flame. Sarah had learned to avoid this part of town. The saloon had never been a place for a woman like her, especially not after what happened to her husband. But she couldn't ignore it anymore. Jack had warned her to stay away from the trouble brewing around here, but it was too late. The trouble had found him, and now it was going to find her too. She had just stepped out onto the porch of her cabin, the evening air still and cold against her skin, when she saw him, Jack, walking toward the saloon. His broad shoulders were hunched slightly against the wind, his boots heavy on the packed dirt road. His hat was tilted low, and the faint creak of his spurs echoed in the night. There was a purposeful stride to his steps, one that sent a shiver of unease down Sarah's spine. It was the kind of walk she had seen men take right before a fight. Without thinking, Sarah stepped off the porch and hurried toward him. Her heart pounded in her chest as the distance between them closed. The baby was asleep inside, but something about the way Jack carried himself tonight made her uneasy. He wasn't just a cowboy anymore. There was a quiet danger about him, one that had been hiding behind his gentle kindness. She hadn't wanted to see it, but now she couldn't ignore it. "Jack!" she called, her voice breaking the stillness of the night. He paused, his back to her for a moment, and then slowly turned. His expression was unreadable, his jaw tight. For a second, Sarah thought he might turn around and keep walking. Instead, he gave her a small nod, tipping his hat. "Sarah." She reached him, standing in the shadows beneath the saloon sign. The flickering lights inside cast an amber glow on his face, revealing the darkening bruise on his cheek, the cut on his lip, the tension in his posture. He was on edge, and it made Sarah's stomach churn with unease. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but the tremor was there. "You're headed in there alone. I don't like it." Jack shifted his weight, his eyes flicking to the saloon doors, as if they held all the answers. "Don't worry about me," he said, his tone rough. "Just a few old debts to settle." Sarah stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "You're not going in there alone. I won't let you." She swallowed, her chest tight with fear she couldn't explain. "Please." Jack's eyes softened for a moment, and for a brief second, she saw the man she had come to know, a man who had come to her aid when she needed it most. But that softness vanished just as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold, hard determination that had always been part of him. "You don't understand, Sarah," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "I'm not going in there for me. I'm going in there for you." His eyes locked onto hers, something fierce and protective burning behind them. "You don't want to owe anyone around here, and that's exactly what'll happen if I don't handle this." She hesitated, wanted to argue, to tell him that she didn't want him risking his life for her, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The man in front of her wasn't the kind who would walk away from a fight, even if it meant getting hurt. And in a place like this, in a town where lawlessness ran like wildfire, men like Jack didn't have much of a choice. She felt a weight in her chest, her heart thundering as the sound of boots and laughter came from inside the saloon. Jack's face hardened again, the vulnerability gone as quickly as it had come. He stepped back, pushing the door open slightly with a creak that echoed through the night. "I'll be out in a bit," he said, his voice distant now, controlled. "Stay inside. Keep the boys safe." Before Sarah could respond, he stepped through the door, vanishing into the darkness of the saloon. The door swung shut behind him with a final thud. Sarah stood there for a long moment, her breath catching in her throat. The distant sounds of shouting and clinking glasses rose in the night air. Then a gunshot. Her heart stopped. Without thinking, she turned and ran toward the saloon, her boots slamming against the dirt as she hurried to the door. She was too late. The sounds of struggle filled her ears, the unmistakable grating noise of boots sliding on the creaky wooden floor, followed by the sharp crack of glass breaking. Inside, the scene unfolded like something out of a nightmare. Jack was standing in the center of the room, his coat torn, his shirt stained with blood, but it was a man lying in front of him that made her stomach turn. Buck, the saloon owner, lay in a heap on the floor, his face bruised, blood trickling from his mouth. The other men in the saloon were scattered, their eyes wide with shock, fear, and anger. Jack looked up, his face tense, but when his eyes met Sarah's, something softened for just a second. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, his voice rough as he wiped blood from his lip. "It's not safe." Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. She had Chapter 5, The Cowboy's Promise. The days that followed Jack's confrontation in the saloon were filled with a heavy, almost tangible silence. Sarah could feel the change in the air, as if the entire town had taken a collective breath and was holding it, waiting to see what would happen next. Jack's presence was a quiet one, always just on the edge of the ranch, working the fields, mending fences, taking care of things with a sense of duty that felt too deep to question. He wasn't just here for a day or two anymore. Something had shifted between them, and now, more than ever, Sarah couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees as the sun dipped low over the prairie, casting the land in a soft golden light. Sarah was outside, tending to the garden, trying to focus on something other than the ache in her heart. The baby had finally settled into a routine, and the hunger that had plagued them both for so long was now just a distant memory. But there was a loneliness that still lingered inside her, a quiet ache she couldn't quite shake. She was wiping her brow when she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves approaching. Her heart skipped a beat, a flutter of nervous excitement rushing through her. Without turning, she already knew it was Jack. The rhythmic sound of his horse's hooves echoed to the still air, the gentle creak of the saddle the only other noise in the vast emptiness of the land. When he finally appeared around the bend, Jack's figure emerged from the fading sunlight, like a shadow, his tall frame outlined against the fiery sky. His hat was low, as usual, his expression unreadable, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something in his posture had changed, less like a man burdened with the weight of the world, and more like someone ready to set it down. "Evening," he called softly, his voice carrying on the wind. "Got a minute?" Sarah paused, wiping her hands on her apron before turning to face him. Her heart fluttered in her chest, and for a moment she found herself speechless. Jack had always been a man of few words, but the way he looked at her now, like there was something he needed to say, but couldn't quite get the words out, made her stomach tighten. "I always have time for you, Jack," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She immediately regretted them, but there was no taking them back. She turned away quickly, focusing on the garden again as she tried to hide the flush creeping up her neck. Jack didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't comment. Instead, he dismounted from his horse, his boots crunching on the dry earth as he walked toward her. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady, but the words seemed to hang between them like a cloud, thick with unspoken meaning. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, tied with a piece of twine. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." Sarah glanced at him, and then at the small bundle in his hand. She held her breath, her pulse quickening. He wasn't one to make grand gestures, not in the way other men did. But there was something about this moment, something about the way the light hit his face and softened his features, that made her heart skip. "I don't have much to offer, Sarah," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper, "but I can offer you this." He held out the bundle, and when she took it, she was surprised to find a small, hand-carved wooden horse inside. Its surface was smooth, the edges worn down by someone who had worked with care. It was right inside the small cabin. The air was thick with the scent of fresh coffee and warm bread, the crackle of the fire mixing with the soft, rhythmic sounds of Sarah's movements as she tidied up the small space. The baby had slept through the night for the first time in weeks, a small miracle in itself. The room felt warmer, not just from the fire, but from the presence of Jack, who had settled into a quiet rhythm of his own these past few weeks. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They were building something together, even if neither of them could have said exactly what it was. Sarah glanced toward the window, the sunlight spilling across the wooden floors. The shadows of the trees outside danced in the morning breeze. She felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar inside her, a feeling of hope. The land had been rough on her, had taken so much from her already, but in Jack's quiet presence, there was a different kind of strength, one that had begun to fill in the cracks in her soul. She heard the creak of boots on the porch just as the baby stirred in his cradle. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Jack had been coming and going from the ranch with an ease that made the place feel less like a burden and more like home. He had mended the fences, worked the fields, even started to help her with small tasks she never thought she'd manage alone. He wasn't just a man passing through anymore. He had become part of the fabric of the place, a quiet force that had begun to shape the world around her. "Good morning." Jack's voice came from the door, rough with the dust of the road, but warm as ever. He stood in the frame of the doorway, his wide-brimmed hat tipping just enough to let his eyes catch the first rays of the sun. "Morning," Sarah replied, glancing over her shoulder with a small smile. She had begun to anticipate his arrival each day, even though she had promised herself she wouldn't let anyone get too close. But Jack had been different. He never asked for anything, no promises, no declarations. He simply showed up, and that, she realized, was something she could depend on. He stepped inside, his boots heavy on the floor, as he removed his coat and hung it by the door. "I've been working on the east fence. Think we'll be all right for a few more days, but it's a job that'll need to be kept up." Sarah nodded, her hand smoothing the flour sack on the table as she spoke. You've done a lot already. I don't know how to thank you for all of it." Jack gave a half smile, crossing the room to stand beside her. "You don't need to thank me. It's just what needs doing." He reached out, gently touching her arm in a way that sent a ripple of warmth through her skin. "It's more than just work, though, Sarah." She turned to face him, the small smile still lingering on her lips, but something in her chest tightened. She felt the air between them shift, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them both. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, close enough that the quiet intimacy of the moment was almost too much to bear. "I've been thinking," Jack began, his voice low. "I don't want to leave. Not again." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she tried to keep her voice steady. "I never asked you to leave." "I know," he said softly, his gaze meeting hers with a kind of quiet certainty that took her by surprise. "But I ain't gonna stay if I can't be useful. If I can't help you and the boy make something of this place." She swallowed hard, her emotions a mixture of relief and fear. There was a part of her that had been waiting for Jack to walk away, for the promise of his presence to fade like so many other things in her life. But now, standing there with him, something inside her knew that he wasn't just another man who would leave when the going got tough. He was different, and for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she wanted to believe that. "You're already doing so much," she whispered, her fingers trembling as they brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I don't know how to." "You don't have to," Jack interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "I'm here, and I'm staying." The words hung between them, simple and true. For the first time in weeks, Sarah didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on her, didn't feel like she was carrying the burden of everything alone. She felt lighter, as though the walls she had built around herself were beginning to crack. And in that moment, she realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Jack. And somehow, that made everything feel different. She took a step forward, her hand reaching for his, the roughness of his palm against hers both grounding and comforting. The connection between them, though unspoken, was clear. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something more, a future, a family. The baby's soft cooing broke the silence, and Sarah turned quickly, her heart swelling as she went to him. Jack stepped beside her, his eyes warm as he looked down at the boy in her arms. "You're a good mother, Sarah," Jack said quietly, his voice thick with sincerity. She shook her head, not sure how to respond. "I try, but it's hard. I don't know how to make this all work." "You don't have to do it alone," he replied simply, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "We'll figure out together." And in that moment, standing in the quiet of the cabin with the soft light of morning spilling over them, Sarah knew that this life they were building was a beginning. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't always be easy, but it was real. It was theirs. The baby gurgled in her arms, reaching for Jack with a small, curious smile. He didn't know yet what all of this meant, but Sarah knew that in time he would understand, that this was his home now, just as much as it was hers. And as Jack's hand found hers once more, she felt the warmth of something new stir inside her. It wasn't just a new day. It was the start of a new life, one that she would face with Jack by her side. Together, the sun was dipping low, casting a fiery orange glow over the vast expanse of plains, painting the sky in hues of red and gold. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the faint sound of distant coyotes calling across the land. The soft creak of saddles and the rhythmic clip-clop of horses' hooves were the only sounds that accompanied the silence between Sarah and Jack as they rode side by side. It had been months since Jack had first arrived at her door, a stranger with a promise in his eyes. Now, as they made their way back to the ranch, the weight of everything that had happened settled in their bones like a shared secret. The land had tested them, had nearly broken them, but together they had endured. Sarah's hand brushed Jack's as they rode. A simple touch, but it felt like a lifetime's worth of unspoken words. They had come so far, from the desperation of that first night to the quiet strength they had found in each other. The sun was almost gone, its final rays shimmering like gold dust across the horizon, and Sarah felt something stir deep within her, a hope she hadn't dared to feel in years. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, "I never thought I'd find a place like this again, a place where I could truly belong." Jack's lips curled into a soft, knowing smile. "You've always belonged here, Sarah. You just had to let yourself see it." With a gentle pull on the reins, they slowed their horses as the ranch came into view, bathed in the last light of day. The door was open, and the wind carried the sweet smell of dinner from inside. Sarah turned to Jack, her heart swelling with more than just love. "Let's build it together," she said, her voice full of quiet conviction. "This life, this home, together." Jack nodded, his eyes steady, and for the first time he let his guard down completely. "Together, Sarah, always." As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, they rode into the future, side by side, their shadows stretching long behind them on the dusty earth. And for the first time, Sarah truly felt like she was home.